Do you have a child who's easily overwhelmed in large crowds, is constantly touching everything, and has no sense of personal boundaries? Or maybe you've got a kid who can't stand loud noises, scratchy fabrics, and all light is just too bright. No matter what your situation is, not only as a parent is it frustrating to watch your child respond inappropriately to daily sensory situations, but it's heartbreaking to watch them struggle every day too. Sensory processing disorder isn't really recognized as a diagnosis in the medical world yet because there's so many unknowns surrounding it, but one thing that we do know as pediatric chiropractors is that the nervous system plays a key role. The brain and the nervous system work together in kids to process sensory information like seeing, tasting, touching, hearing, feeling. But there's also two other sensations that sensory kids really struggle with, and that's movement and balance. These kiddos can struggle with one sense or they can struggle with all seven. SPD really is a spectrum all of its own. So not only does the number of senses affected vary, but so does the presentation. So there's three types of sensory challenge behavior that we see. The first is sensory avoiding. So these kids hate touch. They will avoid all sorts of sensory stimuli. The second are sensory seekers. These kids are the opposite. They want all of the stimulation they can get. They are touchers, they are huggers. And the third presentation is both. And that's where it really gets challenging. Our sensory seeking kiddos will often have a really hard time sitting still. They like to put things in their mouth and chew on them. They love visual stimulation. So bring on the video games, bring on the screen time for these kids. They can't get enough. These are also your kids who can spin around like crazy and they don't get dizzy. They also have a really high pain threshold. Our sensory avoiding kids, on the other hand, are the opposite. Their pain threshold is really low. They seem like they're ultra sensitive to everything. These kids are also clumsy. They will stand and tip over. Nobody pushed them, right? They're picky eaters, and they also find them covering their ears, covering their eyes often just to minimize that sensory exposure. Now, don't get me wrong. Each of those behaviors on its own, happening on a rare occurrence, is perfectly normal as a child is developing. But when you start to see multiple behaviors like that happening every day and your kid is struggling through it, that's when it's time to start looking at SPD as a possibility of what's going on for your kid. So how do these kiddos end up like this in the first place, right? There's a term that we use in our office. It's called the perfect storm, and it starts from birth oftentimes. Okay? A stressful pregnancy or a delivery that's had interventions like induction, C-section, vacuum extraction can start that kid's nervous system off from day one in a state of stress and tension and dysfunction. What we see then, the term that we use for that stressed out nervous system is called subluxation, and subluxation within the nervous system creates dysautonomia. Basically, that's a real fancy term that means that the nervous system is not adapting and responding to the external environment. The brain is supposed to be able to process, to organize, to filter out that extra sensory information, but when subluxation exists within the nervous system, that process isn't happening. So then the body takes all of that extra unwanted noise and it senses it as a form of pain called nociception. So when you see your child trying to avoid certain sensory stimuli, it's because they know that their body isn't able to tolerate it well. The opposite is true for sensory seekers. They are constantly moving their bodies around, touching things, being physical, because that stimulates proprioception, or a type of a movement sensation that drowns out nociception and is actually calming to the brain. Whether your child's a sensory seeker, a sensory avoider, or both, neurologically, those problems all stem within the nervous system. Within 15 minutes, we can do a nervous system scan on your child, locate the presence of subluxation, measure it, and come up with a customized plan to meet their exact needs to help restore function and balance back to the nervous system. PT, OT, and speech therapy all do wonders for kids when they're dealing with sensory challenges, but chiropractic truly fills in that gap. It's the missing link to that neurological piece of the puzzle for these kids. So oftentimes when you've tried the PT, the OT, done the speech, and the kids are doing great, but they've plateaued, chiropractic is usually the next step to fill in that gap and to take these kids to the next level. Here's 4 things you can do to help your kid in the meantime. 1, prioritize sleep. 2, take that kid out for a walk every day outside. 3, prioritize time for free play and lots of free movement. And then 4, do your best to make sure that you're prepping them on any schedule changes or routine changes that day. They'll adapt much better when they know what's coming. We know that raising a child with sensory struggles is extremely challenging, but we're here to help make that journey an easier one for you. Reach out.